Thanks. I was going to grab the mic and walk around, but I think to honor the fact that there's some photographers back here who I guess are recording this, I won't move around or I'll screw up your audio. But it is good to be here with you all today, and that's a pretty easy. You make a lot of pledges. I am like a lot of politicians, even on both sides of the aisle, like to make pledges I can keep, and have done that. So I will gladly make that. When I was saying, for me, it's been about 4 or 5 years, I think, since the governor's been at this conference. In my case, though, I can tell you in the Milwaukee area, there's about 1,500 people that come to the governor's prayer breakfast every year. And in the 8 years I've been the county executive, I've spoken at every single one of them. The governor's never been at those. So that's another one I plan on speaking at in the future if I have the honor of serving as your governor. It is good to be here and timely. I've been traveling around the state quite a bit. During the week, I'm still the county executive. So, for example, this morning, even with the snow, we were in the courthouse about 7:30 working on things, and then came over here for this and a couple other meetings late this afternoon. But on the weekends, I'm traveling around the state quite a bit. In fact, this last weekend's a good example. I was in the Dells, I was in Stevens Point, I was in Anago. In fact, followed up with the mayor after that, knowing part of today's conference of being of interest to communities like Anago, which for me was interesting because I grew up in Delavan, which is very similar in size to Anago in that it's Walworth County, about 8,000 people, and so a lot of similarities. But I was also on the weekend in Merrill, in Tomahawk, in Woodruff, in Minocqua, in St. Germain, in Eagle River. It's my test to remember my itinerary. In Ashland, in Hurley, in Medford, in Bayfield, and then back in the Dells on the way back home. And that was all before the end of the Super Bowl game on Sunday night. So we had a long weekend, but that is typical. We were just up in Superior the weekend before. I jokingly told the local paper there that I actually knew more than north of 29. I knew north of 8, and in this case I knew north of 2, and I've been north enough that I know that Superior is not the northernmost spot in the state of Wisconsin. It's Cornucopia. But that, for me, I think that's important because what I know, having traveled the state for some time, is that people presume that politicians out of Madison and out of Milwaukee only care about these two communities. And while I care about both Madison and Milwaukee, I also care about all the other places around the state of Wisconsin. And I think my travels have shown that sort of commitment. And if I haven't been to your community yet, believe me, I will be soon. And in many cases, I'll be there multiple times from one end of the state to the other. What I have found, though, traveling the state are a couple interesting things. One, people say, don't you get tired? And I said, well, it is a tiresome schedule, but what I get is, in many ways, pumped up. I get strength from being out around the state. As challenging as these times are, I've found that the people of the state are certainly our greatest asset. And the people of the state, by and large, are not down. They're scared, they're concerned, they're challenged with the economy, but they're not down and out. And in that regard, many times when I have listening sessions, when we've gone to events, when we've gone to gatherings, we see sometimes 2, 3, 4 times the crowds that we've seen at events like that in the past. And by and large, when I ask people, is this the first time you've come out to something like this? And I'll ask for a show of hands. Often I'll get anywhere from 2 to 3 times, or not 2 to 3, I should say, from a third to a half the crowd will look and say, that's me. Never been involved before, never been engaged before. But in this economy, with what's at stake both in the state and in our nation's capital as well, with health care and other issues, I've seen that the positive side of all that is it's drawn people out. It's engaged people that were really maybe never engaged before, or said, I vote, that's enough. I don't have to get involved any more than just voting or reading the paper. In these cases, it's people who are standing up saying, no, I need to get in the game. There's too much at stake not to get involved, not to pay attention to what's happening in my local government, in my state government, in my federal government, and that certainly gives me optimism. At the same time, what I found, though, a lot of these stops around the state, and a lot of times besides just giving speeches, I'll stop in a local cafe for breakfast or a restaurant for lunch, and I'll talk to people. And it's like the woman I met the other day up in Rhinelander at Wolf's Log Cabin Restaurant, and she was there celebrating her father's 80th birthday. And she pulled me aside, and she's a small business owner, actually owns her own logging company, and was just devastated, obviously, by a lot of what's happened in the past year and a half with the economy, the timber industry. And she said to me, what am I going to do? I don't know how I'm going to continue to make payroll over the next 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 months into the future. I heard a similar story up in St. Germain with a couple who came up to me and said, for years, they had a 5-person shop, the 2 of them and 3 others, that did metal fabricating. And that because of the economy and the slowdown of things, they had to lay off those 3 employees, which devastated them. They said they weren't related to them, but they felt like they were laying off family, and they had to sell their building and move into their garage. And they were they weren't completely down on things. They were at least grateful that they had some work left and they were still working, although it'd be out of their garage. But they were hoping, they were looking for signs of hope, of optimism, that things were going to get better and they could get back and maybe bring some, if not all 3 of those employees back. And I hear stories like that all across the state. And I think you do as well. I know you're at the front lines of economic development, and these days it's not so much just about development, it's about retaining the economies that we have in our communities, holding our own, trying to keep those employers and those jobs that we have from one end of the state to the other intact, and then hoping that somewhere down the line, if we do that, we can have at least planted enough seeds, laid enough groundwork to make sure that when the economy, and it will, gets better, we're in a position to take advantage of that. I believe that we can do that, but I believe that we got to address the fact that we have significant challenges, but so does the rest of the country. For that matter, so does the rest of the globe. For us, I know we can get out. So I often tell people like that that tell me stories. I say I empathize, I understand, but I also know that help's on the way. It's part of why I'm running for governor. Last spring, before I got in the race for governor, I just was not satisfied with where the state government was headed. Not necessarily the state or the people or employers, but the state government. I don't think the state government's headed in the right direction. And I know that we can make it better. In fact, I think back to 8 years ago, and it was mentioned a little bit in the introduction, but 8 years ago there was a huge pension scandal in my county, in Milwaukee County. And even though I grew up down in Delavan, I moved to Milwaukee years ago to Marquette, met my wife, worked for IBM for a while, and then the Red Cross, was in the legislature. But 8 years ago, I was carpooling back and forth on I-94, and there was a big pension scandal, and it was breaking in the news. A couple weeks went by, and I remember one morning I was driving with about 2 or 3 other lawmakers. We were commuting over there. I was driving that day, and the guy on the radio said, Scott Walker should run for county executive. After I pulled the car back onto the road, I said to the guys in the carpool, no way, just no way. I mean, people were angry. I was angry. My wife was angry. My family was angry. Our neighbors were angry. The more we learned about the millions of dollars that this guy who had the job before I did was giving to himself and to some of his top aides, I just said, this is outrageous. But the last place an elected official wants to be is amongst a bunch of angry voters. And so I kind of set that aside. And then later that day, one of the guys in the carpool whose office was in the Capitol down the way from me, he came in and he said, I've been thinking about this, and you're in the news a lot, you're in the newspaper, you're on TV, you're talking about things, you're making things happen in the legislature. If you ran, people might think you could win. I said, oh my gosh, that's even worse. I said, not only do they have a pension scandal, they have all these problems, they got a structural deficit, they got huge budget holes. I mean, it was so out of proportion, even the county executive was getting paid more than the governor of the state of Wisconsin. I said, there are all sorts of problems here. Who wants to do that? And so I kind of left it aside, and as the week went by, we were watching what was happening at that time, and it was amazing because all the pundits said that the people who were seeking to recall the guy who had the job before me couldn't do it, couldn't pull it off. In fact, in 60 days, they needed to collect 73,000 signatures. Think about that. Think about going to get signatures for anything. In 60 days, they needed to get 73,000. And what amazingly happened, though, is in less than 30 days, they got 157,000 signatures. And it was at that moment, that week or so later, when I realized I had been looking at this all wrong. Instead of just seeing anger, and certainly people were upset, I had misguided what the true emotion was. It wasn't anger, it was hope. It was hope, based on the fact that they believed, not because some party or some campaign or some organization told them, but because literally, not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands of ordinary people did an extraordinary thing. They said, I want my government back. when I realized that that real emotion was hope, that they were standing up saying, we're willing to stand up and do what it takes to take our government back, at that time I realized they needed a leader, someone to be a conduit for that change to make it actually possible. And so I stood up with them and ran for county executive. I got elected, and then maybe just as amazing as the recall in the first place is we got reelected and reelected again after that. In fact, the last time it was, as mentioned, with nearly 60% of the vote in a county that historically votes very much for Democrats. What I found talking to the people there, and I think finding that true across the state of Wisconsin, is people care less about Republican or Democrat. They're not as much concerned about whether you're ideologically on the right or on the left. What people want now more than ever are candidates who know the difference between what's right and what's wrong. Who's willing to stand up and do what it takes to get the state, in this case, back on track? It certainly was true back in our county. And so that's what gives me hope and optimism that we can turn the state around. Because there's no doubt we have challenges. We have challenges with the economy, not just the challenges facing the rest of this country and around the globe, but challenges that are unique and specific to the state of Wisconsin. We have challenges in the state government where we've got a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit facing the next governor and the next legislature. Those are all daunting tasks, but I know just as it was 8 years ago for me, it was a daunting task that we inherited, and we did do what we said we were going to do. We lowered our debt. We lowered the size of our workforce. We improved our bond rating, which all of you at the local level know just how impressive it is. You can't fool bond rating agencies, and yet while the state's bond rating went down, ours went up. We did now 8 consecutive budgets without raising our property tax levy from the previous year. Last year, when the state had the largest budget deficit ever, we actually had a surplus. Now, those are all important things, but you look at on top of that, what did you get for that? Well, last October, we were awarded the gold medal for the best park system in the entire country. Milwaukee County, even with our fiscal challenges, our pension and all that, we got the gold medal for the best park system. While other airports like here in Madison and others across the country saw about a 6% drop on average in average number of passengers, we had the largest December we've ever had at Mitchell International Airport because of our investments, our involvement. And that's important, particularly for economic development in our region. For years, I remember seeing the waiting list for family care or for services for long-term care. And we partnered early on in our administration with the state and wiped out all the waiting lists for long-term care for older adults in our community. Something that was important now and certainly is important for other communities across the state as they seek to expand. We have made major improvements in our budget and our fiscal standing. At the same time, we protected and improved some of our core services. I tell you that all in terms of just putting it in context, because I believe that the next governor of the state of Wisconsin will face incredible challenges. And I don't believe there's any person in any job in this state who's inherited anything close to the kind of challenges the next governor will have in the future, other than the job I have and the position that we inherited. And we've done the things that we've said we were going to do. We've taken the sort of tough stances. We've taken the sort of systematic approach to get things back on track so that the government, and more importantly, the community in our case, can work. I think we can do the same thing for the state. And I want to give you some particulars, because that's an overview, but I want to address some specific things. I think overall, and I think this election is going to be a great debate. Overall, I think this is going to be one of those where maybe we're not going to end up being disgusted about the politics that are involved with the politics. By that I mean, I think if you look at Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett and I, we get along well, we work well together. We just have two very different views of the world when it comes to governing. And we can focus on those issues instead of focusing on personalities. In our case, we very much put our faith in the people and employers of this state. Mayor Barrett, much like Governor Doyle, currently, I believe, puts his faith in the government. More government programs, more government spending, more taxes, in their minds, will lead to more economic prosperity. I don't think that's worked. I think you look by and large nationally at what happened when you add in interest, nearly $1 trillion of government spending into economic stimulus, and we've seen that largely that hasn't had the desired effect. I think instead we need to put more emphasis on empowering our people and our employers at both the local and at the state level to get the state's economy going. And part of that means a couple things. One, in terms of lowering the cost burden, we need to reduce our tax burden. It means taxes on individuals. It means taxes on employers. It means helping local communities control property taxes. It means things even as simple, you might not think about this when it comes to economic development, But I would like, as governor, to phase out the state tax on retirement income. Now, the reason for that is simple. If you think about it, it really ultimately has a very much of a direct impact on economic development. One of the biggest challenges, particularly for small and mid-sized employers, to try and grow, particularly at this time, when the banks are under so much pressure, when our financial institutions are feeling incredible pressure in this state and across the country, is the fact that there's not enough wealth in the state. There's not enough money sitting in those institutions. And in Wisconsin, unfortunately, one of the biggest reasons is the tax climate in the state pushes people into other states when they reach retirement. In fact, I'm convinced that there's only one way, I should say, that any retiree in this state, at least with an accountant, is still in the state of Wisconsin, and that's one word: grandchildren. If it wasn't for grandchildren, financially, not just in Florida or Arizona, but even Texas or Tennessee or, my goodness, even Illinois has a better tax climate for retirees than we do in the state of Wisconsin. Well, if we were to phase that out and ultimately eliminate that, not only would we bring those retirees back themselves, we'd bring their wealth back. You talk about venture capital. I was just talking with Tom Still earlier. Tax credits are great, but they only go so far. What you really need is the wealth itself to be in the state of Wisconsin, so that for startup companies, for expanding companies, for others out there, the wealth actually has to be where it can be invested. Right now, it's being invested in Naples and Sedona and Miami and Austin and, you name it, but not in Wisconsin. That's something that would help all of you on the front line of economic development if you had more resources to tap into in terms of investments. Certainly, there are other ways that we can put other components in there to provide greater tax relief. I think that's one component. I think another thing that eases the cost of doing business is reducing our regulatory burden. I hear it. If I don't hear it once, I hear it a million times. Why is it, that the government isn't more science-based in regulations, and why isn't it more predictable? I hear employers from one end of the state to the other who say, why is it that it takes me to get a permit sometimes 2 days, another time 2 weeks, another time 2 months? Why can't I make this happen? Why does government not have to operate like you all do in the people you're working with in the private sector, operate on the time frame that's sensitive to the fact that we've got employers here? And why is it that they keep adding even more burdens? One of the things that's likely to come up again this cycle is wage lien. Sounds pretty simple until you realize it doesn't just affect businesses going out of business. It affects every other business that wants to tap into capital in this state. It is a carcass mentality mindset. It's saying we're going to argue over the carcass that's left instead of figuring out how many more businesses we can put back into action again here. You look at other things that they've done in the past, and I know I see my friends from Superior here. I was over touring Murphy Oil last year. I think of the combined reporting and the oil franchise fee, those two alone cost Murphy Oil $2 million. Now, certainly the global economy had something to do with them pulling back on their initial plans for expansion, but it didn't help that they were getting a $2 million kick in the face thanks to the state government. Those sorts of implications have an impact on employers big or small all across the state of Wisconsin. We've got to ease the regulatory burden. We've got to streamline things. In fact, overall, I'd like to see a Department of Commerce that focused on promoting commerce, not just regulating commerce, and actually focused on saying, how can we make it easier, not just community by community, but how can communities, be it municipalities, be it counties, seek to take resources that you have for economic development and combine them if needed. I look at areas and say, for years, when I came into Milwaukee County, there was what we used to call the New Berlin Wall, 124th Street. West Allis on one side, New Berlin on the other. And it didn't matter where the jobs were. If it was going into Waukesha, the people in Milwaukee County didn't want it. If it was going to Milwaukee, the people in Waukesha County didn't want it. Well, first Dan Finley and now Dan Vrackas, a former colleague of mine, we said, hey, if a factory comes and there's 200 jobs and it's 10 blocks west of 124th Street, and it's in Waukesha County, but the people who live in my county have access to that, I'm all for it. I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to stand with Dan Vrackas. We're going to do what it takes to bring jobs in there because it's within the proximity of the people I represent. Why can't we do more to empower you at the local level to say, if we've got a project and it's out of my municipality or out of my county, but it's in the same region, we need to give you greater tools and assets to say, let's combine our assets, let's combine our tools in our tool bag, and allow the local governments and the regional economic development groups out there that are vibrant and growing all throughout the state to be more actively involved, to not be tied up in all this regulatory red tape that blocks those sorts of things from happening. We've got to be more aggressive in that. Other states are doing it. It drives me crazy every time, in the last few years when I'd read about Healthy Wisconsin or I'd hear about a tax increase or other things out there, I knew I was going to hear from CEOs, big and small, in my community who'd tell me, guess who's calling me? I got another call from Tennessee, got another call from Texas, got another call from the Carolinas, saying, we know what you're going through, we know what's on the table, we know that now might be the time for you to switch. We need to give those employers reasons to say, I want to be here. I want to grow here. I want to add jobs in the state of Wisconsin. So that means a lower tax burden, a lower regulatory burden, certainly a lower litigation burden. Thank God we held off joint and several liability, but Lord knows that's holding off things going the wrong direction. We need to go in the right direction to ease the regulatory and the litigation burden in the state so that the cost of doing business goes down. We need to give our local employers, our small and mid-sized businesses in particular, the tools they need to deal with rising health care costs, not in the way they're talking about in Washington, not in the way that some in the legislature talked about with the misnamed Healthy Wisconsin, but instead to give local businesses the opportunity to lower their costs by tapping into health savings accounts without state taxes attached to them, to allow a partnership by saying the government can help you identify the true cost, to have transparency in terms of what the costs are for medical procedures in the state, to give the ability to tap into greater risk-sharing pools so that small and mid-sized employers can share the risk and lower their overall cost premiums. Those are all things that the market can drive and the government can be a partner in, but shouldn't be the sole driving source, because we've seen in the past and we're going to see in the future, when you rely solely on the government to do that, they screw things up. They make it tougher for our employers in the state to get better with things like that. A couple other quick things, and then I'll open up some questions. We certainly need to make sure we've got a strong and vibrant education system in the state, both in the public and with our private institutions. We need to make sure that continues not only through 12th grade, but in our colleges and technical schools and our University of Wisconsin system in particular. That's something I'm committed to doing, because that's ultimately, those seeking economic development are the ultimate customers. It's not just the students and the parents like myself, who's got 2 kids in a public high school in Wauwatosa. It's ultimately the employers out there. I was touring a steel fabrication plant in Oshkosh not long ago, and they showed me a stack of applications, and on the application, they asked the name and address and high school they went to, and then they asked a series of basic questions about fractions. And they told me they get so frustrated that they actually make copies of it, strike out any of the personal identifiable information, the name and the address, and they send the applications back to the schools in their area saying, look what you're sending us. They can't do basic fractions. There's no way they can't spend the time and the resources to retrain these kids. We've got to make sure we have a system that's accountable and has the support and the mechanism to do what our employers in the state need. And that's basic fundamentals to get the state back on track. And then the last specific is we need to make sure we've got a strong infrastructure in this system. And when it comes to transportation and to power, transportation and energy in this state, those are key components for economic development. They're not just unique to those categories. If you want to get product from one part of the state to the other, you've got to have a good and vibrant transportation system. That means no more raids on the transportation system. That means protecting those resources, focusing on rebuilding our bridges and roads and highways. It means having a powerful and multiple power grid with a variety of different sources, which I think long term, if we want true alternative fuels, cost effective and not dependent in the Middle East, means freeing up the moratorium on things like nuclear energy and allowing that to be part of our mix along with clean burning coal and other technologies. It certainly doesn't mean putting arbitrary mandates on that we see through the governor's global warming legislation that by any objective measure could cost us anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000, 40 to 50,000 jobs per year. There are plenty of good incentives for green jobs, but we shouldn't be putting in place mandates that cost us jobs. I say I'm all for being green. But if you're going to be green, it should save you green or make you green. It shouldn't take green out of your pocket. And that's something we got to understand. You know, I'm an Eagle Scout when I was down in Delavan. We were always taught to make your campsite cleaner than you found it. So I'm all for protecting our natural resources. You know, one of our core industries in this state is tourism. Tourism, manufacturing, and agriculture are the three big industries that built this state over the past 160 years. They're going to be core to getting us out of this recession in terms of the recovery in the state of Wisconsin. But we can't be doing things that put, you know, one at odds with the other. We want to protect our resources, but do it in a logical way that doesn't compromise our economy. And so that's the kind of logic and common sense I'd like to bring to the agenda as your next governor. The last thing I just say in summary, and this is just to end on an up note, and that is I truly believe in the state of Wisconsin. I've traveled from one end of the state to the other. I've been not just to Superior, but up to Door County, where my great-grandmother lived to be 101, from Prairie du Chien over to Kenosha, from Wausau down to Janesville, and everywhere in between. What I found in this state is there's good, decent, hardworking people, the kind of people that are our asset, the kind of people who embody the Midwestern work ethic, the kind of people who show up on time and put a good day's work in every day they're at work, the kind of people that you not only want to build a company around, you want to build a community and state around. I believe in our employers, and you all know, and many times there are employers in this state that are 2 or 3 or 4 generations deep of family-owned businesses. For those that aren't, like that company up in St. Germain, they treat their employees like family. You treat your employees like family. And despite what others are telling you in other states, you want to be here. You're begging for a reason to stay and invest and grow in Wisconsin. You're begging your government to get out of the way so you can do just that. There's no other state in the country that has the kind of resources we have here. No state in the Union is surrounded by 2 Great Lakes and the greatest river in the country. We're filled with 15,000 inland lakes. That's 5,000 more than Minnesota. Eat your heart out, Brett Favre. In my mind, there's no place better to live in, to grow up in, to raise a family in, to build a business in, to someday retire in. No place in the world is better than Wisconsin. What is failing us, I found from traveling the state, is not our people or our places. What is failing us is our state government. And the reason I'm running is because on November 2nd, I want to change that state government so that we can get the people of the state working again. I know you're at the front line of helping to make that possible. I appreciate the chance to address you here today and to take a few questions. And I look forward, with God's grace and the voters of the state of Wisconsin's blessing, to addressing you next year as the governor of the state of Wisconsin. With that, I can take a couple of questions if you got it time-wise. Sure.
Sure. Scott, you're probably aware of this, but WEDA Competitive Wisconsin, the Counties Association, are sponsoring a Wisconsin competitiveness and efficiency study that will be out around June 1, and that's going to, Deloitte's going to do the study with another consulting firm, and it's going to provide some recommendations on what needs to be improved in the state to make us more competitive, and I'm hoping that you're going to take a close look at that and possibly try to move some of those issues forward as you're elected governor.
Absolutely. And certainly what we've been doing, and we've been adding to it week by week and day by day, we've already started putting together policy groups. We're going to add to that. Anybody here is welcome to be a part of forwarding us ideas. But certainly from that aggressive study, we'd like to incorporate, not just incorporate, but then act on those things, not just run on them, but act on them next year in the legislative session, particularly things that affect the budget and beyond, because I don't think we can wait. In fact, simply put, someone asked me, what are your priorities going to be? And I said, it's real simple. I'm going to ask 2 questions about anything that comes across my desk, any initiative we're going to put forward. And if it doesn't answer these 2 questions, it's not going to be a priority. And they're simply this. What will this do to protect or add to jobs from employers in the state of Wisconsin today? Or what will this do to attract new jobs and employers to the state of Wisconsin? If it doesn't answer either of those questions in the affirmative, that's not going to be a priority. There's plenty of other important issues out there, but in the end, I think at a time like we're in right now, we need to have all hands on deck. We need to be focused on job creation, economic development, things that have immediate as well as long-term impacts. And it bothers me to no end when I look at what's been happening of late in the Capitol, because it seems like a total disregard to the economic crisis we're facing. It's kind of like your house is being flooded, and they're arguing in the Capitol over what the wallpaper should be on the second-floor bathroom, when we should be putting sandbags around the house to keep the water from flooding in. We need to have a focus like a laser beam on jobs and the economy here in the state of Wisconsin. I also think it means not just specific issue by specific issue, it means a mindset change in the leadership of the state government. Right now, under this governor, we have essentially, in my mind, a bureaucrat in chief. Someone who believes the government is the answer to our economic woes, believes more government, more programs, more spending, more taxes is the way to get there. I don't think that's the answer. I think it is a 180. I think we need an advocate in chief, someone who's going to advocate for the employers and people of the state, someone who's going to work with folks at the ground game, right at the front, at the local level, to say what can we do to partner through the state of Wisconsin, through our local economic development efforts, through our regional economic development efforts, and through the private sector to make sure we've got true economic growth and prosperity in this state. I think when we do that, we can get this state working again, because I know what happened. I mean, think about it. 25 years ago, we faced almost identical circumstances. 25 years ago, we were coming out of a national recession. We had a huge budget hole. We had one party in charge of everything. Tony Earl was the governor. His party was in control of the Assembly and the Senate. And I remember their answer back then, 25 years ago, was to raise taxes and fees to such a level that people left the state of Wisconsin. In fact, I grew up near the state line. Jim Thompson, who was governor of Illinois at that time, one of the few, I might add, who's not been indicted. But Jim Thompson put up billboards. You remember what they said? When the last business leaves Wisconsin, please turn off the lights. It was that bad. I look at what happened last February with things like combined reporting and the other things, and I look at what happened last June with the increases in the tax on individuals, with the increase of regulatory burdens, when the capital gains adjustment all went through. Those are things that remind me of 25 years ago. Now, I don't leave you on the sour note, because the good note is the year after, in 1986, our friend from Elroy, Tommy Thompson, came along and said, we can do better than that. This is Wisconsin. We can rebuild this state. We can rebuild this economy. We can put Wisconsin back on the map. And not only did he do that, he put us on the map when it came to reform and all sorts of other things out there. I believe in 1986, in 2010, we can do better than what we did in 1986. I believe we can not only change who the governor is, I believe we can change the state, but we've got to have a bold and aggressive agenda that does just that, and that'll be, in part, some of the things that come out of that report you're talking about. Not that I get worked up about that, but...
When you talk about infrastructure, you mentioned roads and bridges and power, and I think maybe railroads. What role could the state play in expanding broadband services to all residents and businesses in the state? Is there a role for the state?
Yeah, I think the state could be a partner in that in much the same way we're with other infrastructure components, particularly, and having traveled the state not just this past year but for years, I know some parts of the state still have sizable gaps in terms of not only broadband but Wi-Fi and other components out there that put those areas at a competitive disadvantage. And to the extent that the state could partner, not be the sole provider, but partner with local municipalities, with counties, and with economic development corporations, be it at the county or at the regional level, that's something that I think the state government could be a part of. Sure.
Recovery zone facility bonds have been in and out of the news lately, and in particular last Friday with the signing of legislation that kind of creates that statewide allocation process. I'm just wondering, you know, did Milwaukee County, Milwaukee proper, did they find any takers yet for their allocations? And what is your hope or expectation that the $240 million for now Wisconsin will kind of get out the door?
Yeah, I mean, I hope it does, although one of the things I'd be clear on the legislation that's being talked about, and I kind of referenced this before, it wasn't specific to the recovery zone facility bonds, but in general, in terms of pooling resources. I think it's great if multiple jurisdictions, multiple regions want to pool resources to tap into maybe one big project or one big thing that affects a region. I'm a little bit concerned about, and that's not the way it ended up being worked out, but if it's being mandated that, you know, this community has to give up this and give it over here, I think there has to be a careful balance. In the case of the state, I understand why Dick Leinenkugel and the Department of Commerce are looking at that, because they realize, you know, sometimes to get some of these projects going, you've got to have a bigger pot to tap into, and I get that as well. But I think in the in the larger sense, one of the biggest challenges we have on a parochial level at both Milwaukee County and within the city of Milwaukee, which is the mayor's domain, with any of these issues, you still got to have investors out there. You still got to have people willing to develop. And like so many parts of the state, development is largely ground to a standstill. And even with incentives like this, you know, without other capital, unless you can free yourself up to the capital markets, it's something I talked to the Bankers Association about yesterday. And that's something where we need not just state help, but federal help. It's a very schizophrenic market out there. I mean, on one hand, the federal government's pounding on banks saying, lend, lend, lend. At the same time, the federal regulators are coming in saying, show us your books, pull this off, you know, even get rid of on the books of long-time stable customers. And that causes a tremendous, tremendous problem. That's probably the biggest challenge we have to recovery right now in this state, is having access for our small and mid-sized employers to a reliable source of capital and a line of credit, because they don't have it. You all know you can put all the government incentives in there, be it through these bonds or through other things we can bring to the table, but we're not filling in the whole gap. We're only a piece of that gap, and if the other financiers aren't capable or able to come to the table, that's the biggest challenge we face right now. I don't know if that's what you're seeing elsewhere, but it's a great tool, but if you don't have lenders, you know, right now, you know, they're like the groundhog who's back in the hole waiting for, you know, all those more months left of the winter. You know, they're very concerned about popping their head out, not just because of what it might mean to their business model, but because they get popped on the head by the federal government. They get state politicians. I mean, I mentioned wage lien. You talk about wage lien, combined reporting. Those are all things that clamp down on some of our largest lenders, as well as wage lien applies to every lender. We got to make sure we give them more reasons to put money on the table for our economic development projects, not less.
Do we have any other questions? No,
Right. Sure.
Cheryl.
I'm all for the job creation and retaining business. I think that's a great idea. As I look at state government and the different departments that are within state government, will you be creating a mechanism that there's cross communication between departments and that the policies align with what you're looking for to strengthen Wisconsin's economy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Because, you know, the department most grimaced about is the DNR, but really, you know, Department of Transportation, DADCAP, Department of Revenue, there are similar horror stories right down the line. Part of it, you know, having served in the legislature for almost 9 years, know the process fairly well. And one of the biggest challenges I found, DNR is a good example. People spend all this time talking about the appointment of the DNR secretary, when really the biggest problems with the DNR are at the mid and lower level bureaucrat position. They're not the secretary can be the greatest secretary in the world. He or she can be outstanding. But if the administrative code process is so wide and so onerous that frontline employees can do or say whatever they want. I mean, I was just talking to the mayor up in it's not Clintonville. I'm trying to think what community I was in. After a while, you start to blur which community you're in. But anyway, she had a dam problem, and a dam problem, a damn DNR problem. It was about a dam. But she, you know, was just talking about how frustrating it was because it goes on forever. I mean, one of the things I like to do in every department, particularly a department that has a permitting process, is to say, let's put into the statutes what the defined response time has to be for, you know, each of the permits. And that for every day you go beyond that response time, a portion of that permit fee has to be refunded back to the local government, the customer, the consumer, the home builder, whoever it might be. I said, there's nothing that drives government bureaucracy quicker than losing part of your budgetary authority. But there's got to be some things in there that demand some sort of a response. Because, again, when I hear, and you all can tell me if I'm off in a different land than that, but the biggest frustration from developers, from construction firms, from others trying to do projects that relate to economic development is the inconsistency and unreliability. There's no certainty in knowing when I go to this state agency, what and when will I get a response? And as you know, that kills deals. You've got to have some certainty. There's got to be predictability in terms of, if I do all these things, if I line up these forms, if I take these actions, I know within a set amount of time these things are going to happen. That's not happening right now, and I increasingly hear, whether it's through a local, a county, a municipal economic development corporation or authority or department, or whether it's just through private developers, that's some of their biggest frustrations right now. I think you've got to clamp down on that. I also think I'd like to greatly reduce the scope of the administrative code. I think there's way too much leeway. You all know the administrative code has the authority of state law, even though it's not passed in the statutes via the legislature and the governor. I think the more narrowly focused we can get that administrative code so that it's largely defined through things established in the statutes, the better off we'll be. Great. Thanks very much for your time, and I appreciate being here. Like I said, I'll be back next year.